Today, guys, we're going to be looking at the ritual weapon for Heresy, a Strand aggressive frame fusion rifle called Resounding. Now, you heard that right, an aggressive frame fusion rifle. Bungie has given us a new one, and they've actually given us a couple new ones, but Resounding here is actually interesting because it is a Strand aggressive frame fusion rifle. Now, for those that are not familiar with this archetype, Coriolis Force was the first one and only one that was given to us back in Beyond Light. It was one of the most forgotten archetypes in the game, and honestly, one of the worst. But Bungie made some changes to this archetype. First up, instead of it just firing a horizontal spread all at once, it now fires 3 bursts in an increasingly wider spread. Now, it is still horizontal, but you see here in the side-by-side how it looked pre-update and how it looks now. Now, at first, I was expecting this to fire maybe somewhat like a pulse rifle, where you can essentially control the recoil somewhat, or maybe even like Bastion, but it doesn't really do that either. You have a little bit of control, but it fires more or less like a normal fusion rifle, just in a wide horizontal spread. Now, they've also increased the minimum damage when outside of range from 45 to 65%. Range fall off start has also been increased by 4 meters, and range fall off end has been increased by 3 meters. Then lastly, they've given it a 15% damage increase against minors and major combatants, which we'll be discussing later on in the video when we start comparing its DPS to other fusion rifles. Now, with this being a ritual weapon, you can unlock it by ranking up either through Gambit, Vanguard, or Crucible. You even have an ornament associated with each one of those ritual playlists, but because it's a ritual weapon, you do only have the 2 perks per column, which is somewhat limiting, but at the same time, you're still able to go through the process of enhancing, which will apply to both perks in columns 3 and in column 4. First up though, in column 3, we have Subsistence. Defeating targets partially reloads the magazine from reserves. Now, each weapon kill that you get refills 10% of the magazine from reserves, which is then rounded up, meaning you should be refilling 1 shot per kill. Now, something pretty cool to note is if you do manage to kill multiple enemies with a single shot, Resounding here with Subsistence can proc multiple times, as shown right here in the clip. I killed 2 enemies and was then able to reload 2 shots. Now, as for the enhanced version, this refills 20% of the magazine per kill, which actually bumps up our refill amount per kill to 2, which is really good. Pretty interesting perk on a fusion that does pair really nicely with our column 4 options, which we're going to get into in just a moment. Now, our other perk in column 3 is Cornered. Faster charge time or draw time when surrounded by combatants. Now, this is a 15% decrease in charge time when you are within 15 meters of 2 or more enemies. Now, this buff lingers for about 1.5 seconds once you are no longer surrounded, and the enhanced version passively gives you +5 stability, which actually amps up to +10 stability when Cornered is active. Now, this could be an interesting pick for DPS scenarios, but in my opinion, this fusion is more suited for ad clearing and chunking down targets rather than just sitting there blowing your load into a boss. Now, moving on to column 4. First up, we have Hatchling. Precision final blows or rapidly defeating targets with this weapon spawns a threadling at the target's location. Now, considering this is a weapon that cannot get precision kills, you're going to need 3 rapid kills within 3 seconds of each in order to spawn that threadling. Now, for the enhanced version of Hatchling, this just grants us +5 handling. Let me just say, I do like this perk. Granted though, not as much on a fusion rifle. It's all right. There are some things going for it though. On their own, threadlings do pretty good damage. You see it right here against Coral, 12,545. This can be bumped up by using things like Thread of Evolution on a Strand subclass, which increases our threadling damage by 33% and our threadling movement speed by 30%, which kicks up our threadling damage to 16,685 damage against Coral. Again, not a bad pick, but before we settle, let's take a look at our final 4th column offering, Reservoir Burst. This perk reads that when the battery is full, your next burst deals additional damage and causes enemies to explode on death. Now, first up, this perk passively grants 30 magazine stats, which gives us 1 extra shot in the mag. Now, while our magazine is at or above maximum capacity, it gives our weapon 25% increase in damage and also causes enemies to explode on death. Now, that allows our shot here to go from 56,868 damage at base if all bolts land to now dealing 71,088 damage. But keep in mind, this is only when the magazine is full. Now, for the explosion portion of this perk, it was dealing around 25,972 damage against Coral, which is a lot more than what threadlings are doing here. Now, let me just say, Reservoir Burst is one of my favorite perks on fusion rifles. It's good for ad clear, it's got good kabloomies, it's good against tankier targets for that increase in 25% more damage, at least on that first shot, but it isn't a DPS perk. Unless you have a way of like overflowing your magazine, it's just the 1 shot there that's actually getting that bump in damage. damage. However, when it comes to ad clearing, especially when you pair it with things like Subsistence, those two perks together are an S tier combination. Now, for our more minor perks on the weapon, for our barrel, we have small bore. This gives us the +7 there in range, +7 stability. For our mag perk, we have particle repeater, which is +10 for our stability. I know some people are like, Cross, wouldn't this have been better with the magazine perk? You really don't want that with Reservoir Burst, considering that Reservoir Burst already boosts your mag size. You see, guys, the more you boost your magazine, what this essentially results in is that when you do reach like the final 7 shots or whatever, because they're your last shots of your magazine, none of them are actually getting the Reservoir 25% damage buff or kabloomies. Now, you also have a reload masterwork on this, which is all right. Now, as far as our origin traits, we've got Vanguard Vindication, which gives us HP when we land a final blow. It's not much. One Quiet Moment is another one, which grants us increased reload speed and handling when we're out of combat. And then finally, we have the Gambit origin trait, Gun and Run. Rapidly defeating targets with this weapon grants bonus sprint speed. Not really something you need on a fusion rifle, but sure. My speedrunners out there, you get 6.25% increased movement speed for 10 seconds when you score multiple kills. Go crazy. Now, with the perks out of the way, how does this weapon actually feel? How does it fit into our sandbox? And is this archetype worth using? But first up, at base, each bolt from an aggressive frame fusion rifle does 4,739 damage, which is lower than every other fusion rifle archetype. However, this frame shoots 12 bolts, which is quite a bit more than other archetypes. Now, what that means is that in a single shot, if all bolts are landed, it deals 56,868 damage against Coral, with our 1 mag DPS ending up at 53,040. Now, before looking at our other fusion rifles, it's important to keep in mind that all other archetypes received a 30% increase in damage against minors, majors, and champions, as well as mini boss combatants. Now, rapid fire fusion against Coral is dealing 50,355 damage per shot and has a 1 mag DPS of 53,141. An adaptive fusion, which hits Coral for 53,312 damage for a burst, has a 1 mag DPS of 48,591. Now, precision frame fusions are hitting for 55,279 damage per shot with a 1 mag DPS of 46,065. Then finally, we have high impacts, which hit for 67,640 damage with their 1 mag DPS at 48,781. Now, as you can see here from our testing against Coral, at base, aggressive frame fusions actually have really good DPS, just barely falling behind rapid fires. But a few things to note here, this is just at base. There's no charge time masterworks. We're not including traits. We don't have artifact mods slotted in. Keep in mind, aggressive frames, although yes, at base on paper are a little bit better, they do require you to land 12 bolts. And not every target is going to be thick enough to take that many bolts. Even testing against Coral here, we would miss at least 1 bolt, if not more at times. So to get the full damage, you're going to have to be close enough, and it's going to have to be a thick enough target to make full contact. Now, with the base testing out of the way, how does Resounding do though in the live game, especially against some of the best fusion rifles per archetype? We've got some phenomenal fusion rifles that can overflow the magazine, fusion rifles with controlled burst, which is the top DPS perk for fusions. We also have particle reconstruction this season, alongside unraveling orbs, which is great for Strand fusion rifles. But that takes us to our testing here. First up, Resounding with Reservoir Burst, as well as cornered against Greg, it was able to put out 1,156,588 damage. Next up, we have Scatter Signal, our rapid fire choice with overflow and controlled bursts, and one of my most used fusion rifles this season. It was able to put out 1,326,882 damage. Now, for our adaptive fusions, another one of my favorites is Techian Force. This one comes with rewind rounds and controlled bursts, and as you can see here, it's doing a total damage of 1,178,168 damage against Greg. And keep in mind, guys, this is over the entire damage phase, so I know I'm not giving you damage per second, as we just covered that in our base, but TLDR in this is the more damage here and the total damage number, the better. Now, for our precision frames, I was actually using this axial with reconstruction and controlled bursts. This puts our total damage at 1,208,845. Then finally, for our high impacts, we have the Eremites. You can get this one with Envious Assassin and controlled bursts, and this actually was able to put out 1.5, almost 1.6 million damage. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, Cross, this isn't really a fair test. These are all God roll crafted fusion rifles, which obviously excel in terms of DPS, whereas Resounding here is meant to be an ad clear fusion. You're right, I mainly just wanted to show you where it sits though. However, it does make me excited for the future of aggressive frames, and perhaps maybe one day we'll get a controlled burst aggressive frame fusion rifle. On top of that, we're having to do things like reload. There's no overflow here, no no envious assassin. You get the point. One of the main things, though, that Resounding has going for it is that it is a Strand weapon. And with combinations like Unraveling Rounds, Particle Reconstruction, and Horde Shuttle, this makes this a good fusion rifle this season. However, if we ever find ourselves in the future with an aggressive frame fusion rifle with actual good DPS perks, I do believe this archetype is going to shred. Now that we've talked about the perks, though, we've talked about the damage, how do we feel about this fusion rifle? And most notably, how do we feel about this archetype? Guys, to be honest with you, this change, this archetype was the last thing I expected from Bungie. I honestly thought they forgot that Coriolis even existed, or that the aggressive frame archetype was even a thing. But after this change, I can confidently say that they are worth considering. The damage on paper is really good. Resounding is also a very solid fusion, especially for the season with things like Particle. That Subsistence Reservoir Burst is quite nice. Personally, I do lean more toward things like Slide Shot and Reservoir Burst, simply because unless you're getting a kill, you're not going to be proccing Subsistence. Now, luckily for us, with the combination of Unraveling Orbs and Horde Shuttle, I actually found we could spawn in a decent amount of threadlings, while also still being able to use Reservoir Burst, those kabloomies. You see the synergy here. With that being said, though, I don't believe aggressive frame fusion rifles are perfect, as I still feel like the ease of use isn't quite there when it comes to landing bolts. You can even find that sometimes you will outright miss targets. And I know some people are going to be like, Cross, sounds like a skill issue, but that's just my experience playing with this fusion, guys. Granted, against thicker targets, mini bosses and whatnot, it's fine, but I actually wish this could be consolidated a bit more, which I know we're kind of like impeding on Bastion's territory, but I'm gonna be okay with that. Will we use this fusion rifle outside of this episode? Probably not. To be quite frank, no one was using fusion rifles before this episode, outside of maybe Merciless. But with combinations like Unstoppable Fusion, Particle Reconstruction, the Strand synergy we have going on with artifact mods, Resounding here is a strong option. And I know there's like some debate going on right now, and I have no idea how this got started, but people are literally saying that they don't choose weapons based on the artifact mods. And my question to you is how? How can you not? The artifact mods, in my opinion, literally changed the meta season to season. It is the deciding factor for me on what I use. And fusion rifles this season, whether it's Scatter Signal, Riptide, or a number of other options, they are performing very well right now in all types of content. So for my folks that are going to be grinding for Resounding, this is still a solid option and one that will help you out this season. I do look forward to seeing potentially an ease of use buff given to this archetype on top of another aggressive frame fusion rifle with just some better perks to choose from. Until then, though, that Subsistence Reservoir Burst roll will serve you well. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.